Hi, my name is Jennifer Day. I'm a senior lecturer in urban planning in the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning at the University of Melbourne. It's with regrets that I missed this week's conference, but thank you to the organizers for allowing us to send along this video instead. With my colleague Virginia Miller from the City of Port Phillip, I am leading the Urban Manufacturing Project. This is a collaboration between the University of Melbourne and the 5 Inner Melbourne Action Plan, IMAP, councils. Those councils work together regularly to promote the prosperity of the Inner Melbourne region. The Urban Manufacturing Project centers on understanding the needs of small urban makers. These are small firms that produce tangible goods: jeans makers, tofu makers, bicycle makers, furniture makers, all kinds of makers in the Inner Melbourne area. The core goal of this research is to deliver policy-relevant findings that provide local and state government with guidance in making strategic decisions about urban lands. In our interactions with governments, we've become aware that government is aware of the potential cost of losing its industrial lands and displacing the makers on those lands. At the same time, we're also aware that government is under constant pressure to upzone industrial to residential land and to allow for the development of housing on that land. The challenge the government faces is that they lack robust evidence to support the preservation of industrial land in the Inner Melbourne area. This is the place where we think our project adds a lot of value. We have developed a multifaceted approach that examines the urban employment problem from 3 different angles: the land approach, the sector approach, and the economic approach. In this presentation, I describe those approaches and our findings to date. Now I'll talk about the specifics of the study. The purpose of the study, as I said, is to help local governments, particularly those participating in the IMAP, to develop informed strategies as they make decisions about whether there is a value in preserving urban industrial land. As you know, industrial land uses in Inner Melbourne are under considerable pressure for rezoning. We contend that there is an ample opportunity to realign the land concerns of councils and the industrial activities in Melbourne. Our project is titled The Dilemma of Urban Employment Land, an inquiry into the viability of small urban manufacturing in Inner Melbourne. Our study seeks to address questions that we don't have existing data for. So we take this 3-pronged approach. The land approach, that comes from the angle of attempting to understand how industrial zoned land in Inner Melbourne is currently being used. Our sector approach seeks to understand questions about the value of central locations for firms in the small manufacturing sector. And our economic approach looks at the broader benefits and economic impacts and contributions of small urban manufacturers to the local, state, national economy. Each of these approaches is associated with a lot of sub-questions. For the land approach, our core inquiry is into how small maker firms are using in industrial and other lands to practice their crafts. Central to this core inquiry are these other related questions, such as this one. Are new types of manufacturers different to those of traditional manufacturing emerging in the Inner Melbourne region? So is there a new type of manufacturing emerging that perhaps requires less space or is less dirty or requires different kinds of interactions and connections and networks to really thrive? Now, we did interview one tofu maker in Richmond who told us that he's significantly adapted his product in recent years to include the value added of serving meals in addition to the production of tofu. And he further told us that moving into a commercial shop in a new building would be next to impossible for him because new facilities lack 3-phase power, concrete floors, and rear access. So these crucial elements for his business, if he gets relocated, which he's worried about, will make moving into a new premise impossible or very, very unlikely. And it's much more likely that his firm will close. The sector approach, this looks at firm intention, growth, and prosperity. So this examines questions of the interactions of inner city land uses with those requirements of firms, the things that firms need to survive, innovate, grow, and prosper. In Melbourne, it's possible that the displacement of urban manufacture of some central cities could have a stifling effect on innovation, creation, growth, prosperity of individual firms. It's possible, for instance, that rather than merely relocating, firms that are forced to leave the inner suburbs may simply close. That would remove their value added and their innovative capacity from the pool of Australian industries. Toward understanding this sector, we ask questions such as, is this central location required for these firms to survive, grow, prosper? Our economic approach examines impacts that small urban manufacturers exert on the urban economy, on the state economy, perhaps on the national economy. We hypothesize that impediments to these firms can have a stifling effect on the entire economy, or conversely, that these small firms can exert positive influences of their own on their own sector and other related sectors. So a good example of a question in this approach is, what would be the overall economic costs, local, state, national, of continued loss of urban industrial land in terms of jobs, value added, and innovation within the small urban manufacturing sectors? Our project is now moving to a more advanced phase. We've spent a significant amount of time just in the data that exists, trying to understand how whether these data sources have the capacity to address the questions we're asking. So we've looked at a number of council-held data sets, the Census of Land Use and Employment, which is a data set developed by the City of Melbourne for its jurisdiction, the Australian Business Register, Census Journey to Work data. And what we're finding now is that what we found is that those data sources really cannot answer the questions that we have. We've also, to this point, we've held an inception workshop, the results of which I will discuss. They've been quite significant. This is one of the things that the inception workshop has done, is generated possibilities for new data. The ABR is discussing a possible small urban manufacturers data set with us. And we've also generated our Phase 1 report, which is available. Our ongoing work includes the 2 exploratory fieldwork studies that we have currently going, and a survey that we're getting ready to implement. In addition to that, one thing that came out of our inception workshop was that the makers wanted a symbol of our participation, their participation and our commitment. And so we've generated that, and I'll describe how we've done it. And we're moving on to expand our scope into an AR linkage project, where we're looking at including Moreland Council, Metro Melbourne, Regional Victoria, and possibly all of Australia in the study scope. So looking at that original data that we analyzed, the main lesson, this is the Census Journey to Work data looking growth between 2006 and 2011. And the main lesson, as you can see here, is that manufacturing is in decline. The number of people going to work in manufacturing declined by almost 20,000 between 2006 and 2011. Now, we have a hypothesis that makers are small urban makers are the exception in this case, but it's really impossible to tell from this data set because the Journey to Work data does not give any indication of the size of the firm that a person works in. Other data sets give a little bit of a more nuanced picture. So this is the Australian Business Register data set, which breaks out breaks out employment by ANZIC code. And what this shows you is that some firms are growing and some firms are declining. And that is very, very useful, but doesn't, again, tell us much about small urban makers because the ABR data reports by firm, but does not give any information on firm size. The Census of Land Use and Employment, this is a City of Melbourne data set, so not available in the other IMAP councils or consistently in any other councils in the state of Victoria, although the census has been done in other jurisdictions, just not consistently, does give us some indication of firm size. So what we know from the CLUE data, we were able to break out firms by small. In this case, we designated small as fewer than 20, and very small, firms with 5 or fewer employees. And something very interesting came out of this data. When this is now, again, remember, this is just the City of Melbourne, so it's not representative of the IMAP area or the metropolitan area. But in that other category, very small firms were heavily represented. And we spoke to one maker, for instance, at a roundtable discussion on makerspaces, who said that he's been in this other category for 30 years, can't break out of the other category. And what this points to is that we simply don't know where many of our makers fit in the industrial classification system. So the next thing we did was to consult our stakeholders. We held a project inception workshop on the 28th of May. And we assembled attendees, 6 to 10 people at a table, and we asked for their input on a number of issues related to our study. So the objectives of the workshop were twofold. First, we wanted to communicate the objectives and to-date findings to our stakeholders. We wanted to elicit their participation, and we also wanted to get their feedback about our approach. So we described our approach to them, and then we had 3 rounds of feedback. Round 1 asked them to describe the importance of the issue to them. Round 2 asked them to critique the study approach. And round 3 asked how they would be willing to contribute to the project. The workshop was very insightful. One of the major insights that came out of it was that makers really wanted a tangible symbol of their participation. So for them, participating would mean providing data. And they were quite enthusiastic about doing that, especially if it meant helping their businesses to thrive, grow, and prosper. But they really wanted a tangible symbol of their participation. A lot of them had been involved in economic development and engagement schemes run by councils, and reported that those schemes had lost momentum, petered out. They really wanted a symbol of our participation in the project, our commitment as a project team, as government, as the university, to keeping this project going. Incidentally, this is me in the Footscray makerspace in a sound chair designed by one of our participants and maker, Ilya Minik, who along with Matt Rowbottom does a large part of the organizing for the Footscray Maker Lab Cooperative. Now I note they are being resettled, evicted from their premise in Footscray, and are currently seeking a new location. The land that they are on, they're being evicted because upzoning to residential is being carried out later this year. So we've decided to take up the makers on those suggestions, and I'm going to describe how we do that in a little while. But first, I want to briefly describe our projects, our 3 ongoing projects that one taking a land approach, one taking a sector approach, and one taking an economic approach. These projects are each headed by a Master of Urban Planning student at the University of Melbourne, closely supervised by me, Jennifer Day. The students are Jane Archer, Targol Coram, and Justin Malkovich. Jane Archer's query takes off from the land approach. She's examining the Gipp Street and Cremorne precincts in the city of Yarra, and seeking to understand why whether firms in these locations are choosing those locations for creative and clustering proximity purposes, or whether there are some other driving factors. So she's really looking to see whether characteristics of networking and clustering are present in this community of makers in that area. And her hypothesis is that clustering benefits are not the main draw card for those who choose to locate in the Gipp Street and Cremorne areas. From the sector approach, again, this is another exploratory approach, qualitative methods. Targol Coram is examining small makers in the entire IMAP area. And her research is piggybacking from work in the United States by geographer Saskia Sassen. Saskia Sassen describes new manufacturing as the new type of maker, which is increasingly incorporating services into their offerings to customers. So not only do you buy a bicycle, you buy a high-end custom bicycle that comes with a day of fitting and a lot of nice coffees and a nice experience, and you pay a premium for that. So she's looking particularly into whether makers in the inner Melbourne area are leaning toward this new service orientation, and given that, whether location is important to how they do business. Justin Malkovich is the third student, and he is examining the economic approach. Now, his work is largely driven by a survey, which I'm going to describe below. But his questions are around the economic cost of losing these small urban maker firms. So he's asking a lot of questions about the importance of skilled labor and whether or not that labor is available outside the inner Melbourne area. What factors are driving the location decisions of these businesses? Is it land? Is it labor? Is it capital? Is it accessibility? Is it innovation? And again, is the central location required for these firms? Now, we did say that the makers were, earlier I said that the makers were really seeking a symbol of our commitment and participation. And the way that we decided to provide that, we did decide to provide that, first of all, which is a big step for us in that it required a lot of investment and looking into technology, but it was worth the effort. And what we've decided to do is create a dual-purpose website, working with Harvest Digital Planning, that at once creates the data that we need, and at the same time creates that maker community that the makers were looking for. So this is the front page of our website, our project website, which is in beta at the moment. And you can see underlying it, there's a map. Now that map will ultimately be populated by makers, but right now it's blank. And this is the front page where a maker can go to register for the site. So they click on Join the Maker Community, and then they go into a page where we're screening them for whether or not they're a small maker. They registered for the site, and then they go on to fill out our survey. So right now the website is under construction, but this survey, lots of other surveys developed by Harvest have been wildly successful in gaining input from a target community. So for instance, this includes the City of Melbourne's the Melbourne City Council's public consultation on its bike strategy. This is a snapshot of that, the final product of that bike strategy. And these are different places where different individuals have gone and made a complaint or a comment about the bike network in the Melbourne area. So we hope that eventually our site will go from being a little bit blank to looking something like this, populated with lots and lots of makers of all different sorts. And we hope makers across the Melbourne region will be enthusiastic about our project and wish to participate.
Thanks for listening. As you can see, the findings to date raise a lot of questions that remain unanswered. Based on the success of Phase 1, we are interested in expanding the project's scope. We'd like to include more exploratory work, develop a larger and more comprehensive survey, and generate more existing data sources that require partnerships for us to use. To these ends, we've received permission from the IMAP to continue to expand the work. We plan to seek funding from an Australian Research Council linkage grant, which is due in November. We hope to leverage the Council's investment to generate a multi-year research program that addresses our questions across the land, sector, and economic approaches. In addition to this application, we will continue our current work and seek to deliver findings from the pilot projects. Thank you for your interest in the Urban Manufacturing Project. I now place you in the capable hands of Virginia Miller, who will take your comments and questions.